All right, we're live. We are live. We are back. We all take a deep breath, and we're going to that wonderful calming film H454.
Oh, and it's just getting better and better down the hall.
So anyway, we started yesterday looking at the divisions amongst the non-homestead. We've had a lot of interest. I'm going to ask people to try and hold it 5 to 10 minutes so that everybody can be their normal business hours. And then, we will be taking more testimony. That I can guarantee. Okay, so Amy, just introduce yourself to the record and we'll go from there.
Sounds good. For the record, my name is Amy Spear. I'm the president of the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. In the interest of being brief, I do have a longer testimony that I submitted earlier.
That's probably on the website.
Yep. So there will be some additional details if I cruise by anything.
Okay.
So I appreciate the opportunity to weigh in on the proposed property tax classifications. As passed by the House with the 4 property tax classifications, we do have serious concerns regarding the impact of this expansion on Vermont's business climate, affordability, and overall economic stability. And we do very much believe that any reform to our property tax system should prioritize simplicity, predictability, and fairness across the board. So just to provide some context of where we are, that helps to frame my comments today. And I mentioned this the last time I was in here. In 2023, Vermont ranked 3rd nationally in total state taxes per capita and 1st in property taxes per capita since 1999, when property taxes were at $650.27. We've been in that position. So if we assume an average inflation multiplier of about 1.7 over the span from 1999 to 2023, the figure would really roughly be about $1,100 versus that $1,800 that we saw last year. So that does help to frame my context of, that such a disproportionate increase in property taxes going higher than inflation exacerbates the affordability challenges for residents and businesses and does warrant very careful consideration before adding any complexity to the tax code. So you'll see that theme throughout. When we're looking at the key concerns for expanding the classifications, I'll be very high level here because I really want to spend more time on the recommendations. Simplicity and predictability. We have concerns about potential revenue volatility and the administrative burden with all of these new classifications. Looking at equity and fairness, we have concerns with the uneven liabilities that could exist and base fragmentation. So more segments could erode the principle of similar treatment for similar properties, inviting punitive distinctions, transparency and accountability. Concern that a complex scheme does make it harder for taxpayers to understand classification criteria, undermining the trust and clear cost containment measures that I know this committee and others are working on in the education, finance, and delivery world right now. Again, looking at potentially distorted investment decisions based on different classifications or trying to find the best rate possible and competitiveness risk. Just sharing an anecdote from our manufacturing day that we had in early April. Vermont manufacturers are already citing cost of doing business disadvantages versus other states like North Carolina, Michigan, South Carolina. And this continued fear of tax growth is, could be driven by a complex system, which could ultimately tip some decisions. And that's the last thing that we want to see is having that erosion there in our business space. I do want to mention here that we are supportive of the shift to the foundation formula for a couple of reasons. So I want to thank everybody for their work on that thus far. So while we do have concerns about property tax classifications, from a tax perspective, we like the foundation formula because we're looking at the uniform tax effort, fairness, transparency and predictability, streamlined administration, and then from an education perspective, provides an opportunity for equity, adequacy, targeted support for student needs, and then predictability and stability again. So where I'd like to spend the most of my time today are on the recommendations that we have for property tax classifications that address the concerns that I kind of breezed through earlier. The goal is to have a simple, equitable, transparent, efficient, and stable system. First recommendation to consider would be to postpone or scale back the expansion of classifications. So the recommendation would be to amend the bill to delay adding new categories until a comprehensive statewide review examines the full interplay between property taxes and cost containment measures that are underway for education delivery and finance. Meanwhile, retaining the existing homestead and non-homestead framework and explore modest adjustments that meet policy goals without adding that complexity. The rationale there is introducing multiple new classes creates uncertainty in revenue projections, increases administrative burdens, which could then exacerbate Vermont's already high per capita property taxes. As I said before, a stable, predictable system is going to be essential as we move forward. Another recommendation could be to consolidate similar categories. So revising classification language to merge non-homestead apartment and non-homestead non-residential into a single non-homestead category. The rationale there is in a couple of buckets. Market consistency for one. Both categories function as investment properties subject to market fluctuations. Combining them better reflects their economic reality. Horizontal equity, treating comparable investment assets the same, prevents arbitrary distinctions and potentially punitive rates. Administrative efficiency, an unverified non-homestead category, a unified non-homestead category does reduce the complexity, making the system clearer for taxpayers and administrators. And again, I would say on policy alignment, this change does support broader reform goals, addressing education costs and affordability by maintaining a coherent data-driven approach to our ed finance system. My last recommendation for the committee to consider would be to institute a mandatory regular review of this mechanism, requiring a periodic review. So whether that's every 3 to 5 years of property tax classifications and their impact on revenue stability and cost containment. This could be a good opportunity for that look back. There's a lot of transformative changes that are on the table. It might be good to have something like this in the language. The review would be able to assess fiscal and economic outcomes of classification systems, measure administrative costs, compliance burdens, and revenue fluctuations, and allow adjustments to classification criteria and multipliers based on evolving data. So again, by adhering to the principles of simplicity, predictability, and fairness, Vermont can maintain a stable, equitable property tax system that supports long-term economic growth and addresses affordability challenges. We do ask the committee to refine rather than expand the current classification structure. I will stop there and take any questions. How do I do for time?
I think it was fine. Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You did talk fast. Thank you. I just wanted, because you were talking fast and I was trying to process as you were doing it. What I think I'm hearing you say is that you wanted the rental, the non-homestead apartment, which is essentially rental properties.
Mhm.
That one you're concerned about, and you'd rather have it combined back with non-homestead, non-residential. So like all the other business categories. And I'm trying to understand your sort of point about simplicity, because for me, I understand rental property. It seems simple to me. I mean, I think apartment, I think it's bad that name. It should be just rental.
Mhm.
But how is that? Can you explain that a little bit more, why you don't think that's simple and that's confusing to you or maybe the people you represent?
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple layers there. So I would say, the testimony from the Department of Taxes yesterday, asking to remove the non-homestead apartment category. I will not speak to that since they are supposed to use yesterday, but One of the reasons, the rationale behind this is just to try to consolidate the number of classifications. So if there is a desire to expand classifications, the recommendation would be to merge those two for a couple of reasons. And I understand like there is, the apartment and the commercial lens that folks might be looking at, but when you look at the true purpose of those two types of properties, they are at their heart investment properties. So whether it's a commercial, industrial, or apartment, they are at the end of the day an investment property for the property owner. So I guess that's the 50,000 why they should be combined.
Okay, but the way I'm thinking about it is that the apartment category or rental category is housing. And I think, we can't bind the future legislature to do anything, unfortunately. But I think the sort of policy consideration is maybe a lower rate for the housing part of it. So that to the extent that those are, investment properties, people who are investing in housing would get a lower property tax rate. And isn't that you were arguing for lower property tax rates? So wouldn't that be something you would want?
So yes, lower property tax rates are the ultimate goal of going through this massive education finance reform. But we have to look at the entire continuum of all the pieces that are paying the tax system, because yes, it is housing, but the housing, people that live here are also working here. And so the commercial properties and the apartments at the end of the day, I understand it's housing, but they're the same purpose. They're an investment property for the owner. Versus an apartment, whoever is living there for housing is not the owner of that unit.
Right.
And so that's really the rationale there. If we're looking at the system as a whole, though, I would much rather say, why don't we look at single category or keeping the homestead non-homestead? I would say if we're looking at the order of priority or the order of preference, I would say simplicity. So less classifications, I think, would lead to better outcomes versus having to break out more classifications, which could come to it.
Yeah, but from a policymaker perspective, having the differentiation is helpful because we can sort of target, okay, we want to promote this thing, housing in this case right now, or, we want to, not have as many second homes. So you can use them as a policy tool. And I know maybe you're not so psyched about that as a policy tool, but okay. I thank you.
Okay, other questions? Thank you. Okay, Samantha Sheep.
Hello. And it'll just be me today. Josh is out.
Okay, all right.
Thank you for having me. My name is Samantha Sheehan. I'm the Municipal Policy and Advocacy Specialist for the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. Also known as VLCT. We represent all Vermont municipalities and certainly yours that you live in and serve. And I will be talking to you today about Section 62, I think.
Also what it is.
The reappraisal section.
Okay.
So briefly, I will say, unlike most of the many varied topics that we come in to discuss with you, the LCT members chose not to take a position on reappraisal. And that should not be alarming or upsetting to anyone. Among our 247 member municipalities, some are managing the process of reappraisal at the local level extraordinarily well. And the current system and authorities and responsibilities they are tasked with grand list maintenance, they feel are appropriate and that they are more than up to the task. Other municipalities are certainly struggling to maintain fair and frequent enough appraisals. They're struggling to have the appropriate resources. They may have a hard time filling lister positions, whether those are appointed, elected, or contracted. And so there's sort of a variety of perspective across our membership. how we have engaged with this proposed, but unquestionably, if the legislature chooses now or in the future to make significant changes, such as is proposed now in H454, that will affect all local governments in Vermont. So we have engaged with this topic so far in this session and just really doing our best to offer food for thought in some of the major sort of components and areas of concern that we have identified in going from a town by town mass reappraisal to a regional district approach. Those are, we support local control for municipal grand lists. We advocate that you create adequate resources for towns to convert or take on any new rules, guidelines, requirements, standards that may be an outcome of this change, that there is a reasonable timeline to hear grievances and appeals, which we expect to increase as a result of such a dramatic change in reappraisal systems, and that there be strong and frequent input and oversight from local officials as we sort of take on this transformation. For that reason, our primary point of advocacy was to have what is identified in this section of the bill as the Regional Assessment Stakeholder Working Group. That also was the primary recommendation of PBR's second report on regional reappraisal. And I will talk about sort of why it's so important that local level technical experts from sort of across the life cycle of a reappraisal be involved in developing the new system and a uniform set of standards and guidelines for reappraisal to come under in the future. So one of the tasks of this stakeholder group this summer will be to identify the authority or authorities who will contract for and conduct reappraisal. Earlier drafts of this bill tasked PBR with holding a regional reappraisal contract. However, it maintained the authority and the responsibility of municipal listers to certify the grand list. That creates a tension in the authority and responsibility of the grand list maintenance. And just as concerning, if the contracted party, if it was a firm, a third-party firm, a non-governmental firm, were to fail in its obligations under the contract, who enforces that? Is it a state agency or is it a municipal official? So this was a point of confusion that we highlighted early and we think deserves some real thoughtful consideration in order to figure out a right answer. And if the answer is, if the stakeholder group comes to a consensus that multiple municipalities should hold a single contract together, we think it's unclear if they have the authority to do that now. And there may be recommendations that are right to make to the legislature to enable that type of partnership in the future for the purpose of a regional approach to reappraisal. The second task of the working group is around the question of what body will hear grievances and appeals over a property valuation. And right now, typically that goes to a local board of civil authority. One idea that had a place in this bill at one point was a regional board of civil authority that would have municipal representation from each municipality in the district.
Countywide, maybe like a county government kind of thing, maybe, Samantha?
I don't get too excited, Senator Hardy, because that's not that to be I'm going to provide some fair critique of that approach. So, listen, there's positives to doing that in fairness, in equity, in consistency, and in the process of hearing appeal. There's some inherent good things that come from having a larger body from a larger community here, a parcel, you know, the appeal of evaluation of a single parcel. However, this style of mass reappraisal, as contemplated in a regional system through regional districts, is likely to have a very high rate of first round appeal. And if you have a body of 24, 28, 30 volunteers hearing such a large volume of appeals, there's a real feasibility concern there. Do you need a quorum? What is a quorum? I know when Burlington went through its mass reappraisal in 2021, the BCA met every day for most of a day for weeks in order to provide the right to due process to property owners and meet the statutory deadline to certify the grand list. So for example, so here I won't repeat these, you can read them later if you're interested, but you can expect a rate of appeal of 1 to 5%. We are encouraging you to prepare for 5% or more. If we take Windsor County, for example, if there's 24 municipalities, so 24 BCA members, there's approximately 32,000 parcels in that county. You could expect between 300 and 1,600 first round appeals. So how do you schedule 24 people to hear 1,600 appeals before January 1st, which is what's proposed in this bill as the new deadline for the grand list?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So the working group is supposed to make a recommendation about appeals. So
Correct.
So you're fine with them making a recommendation about appeals. There's nothing in the bill
We're
right now that says,
enthusiastic.
okay, there's
Yeah.
nothing that says about who would have appeals.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. That, I believe, you know, that was the work of the House and it was a recommendation that we made before the bill passed.
Oh, no. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe they listen to somebody else.
I was just always I just thought that each town would retain its board of civil authority, each town would hear its own appeals within each town, that there would not be a regional board of civil authority.
That may be the logical sort of solution, but we think that should be worked out at the table.
However, I remember when Montpelier had 300 appeals. First year capped at.
Yeah,
I think I spent several days, a week, for months, because I was home and my kids were in school, looking at houses. That's 300 in Montpelier's a higher percentage than 500 in Burlington. And yeah, if you're going to a county-wide and an outside firm, depending on how well your listers have done locally, you are probably going to get a higher number of appeals until that initial adjustment is made. And we do need to have a realistic timeline, but also one that works. So the tax bills can be put together and grand list can be done. And I understand we ran into the lister certification last year, if you remember, when we went to the statewide poles and wires. Property, because everybody was in there with a hodgepodge of how they were valued. And yes, there was a lot of concern on the part of listers that since they didn't do the appraisal, how could they certify it? So we will, I think, have to do that.
that is a great point. So if PBR holds a reappraisal contract, but the municipal lister or appraiser must certify it, can they appeal evaluation? Like, can the municipality say the contracted appraiser found a valuation that we object to, we think it's undervalued or we think it's overvalued, and before certifying, like, these are the questions that really need to be worked out amongst the professionals and the technical experts, including those who have defended municipal valuations in the past.
Okay.
So this is, so something else that the bill does is so you acted last year. For last year's legislature acted to move us towards a 6-year timeline rather than having the reappraisals triggered by CLA. 2 years ago.
That was 2 years.
Okay, 2 years ago. In part or in whole, as a result of that, following the sort of totally dramatic changes in the housing market that happened between 2020 and 2023, most of Vermont's municipalities came under reappraisal order. Many of them have taken steps to make a plan for municipal-wide reappraisal. PVR is reporting that those reappraisals are booking out already to 2029. In normal times with adequate resources that are fully met, a reappraisal would take about a year anyway, a municipal-wide reappraisal. So our concern is in the change from a municipal-wide system to a regional-wide system, what happens to the pending reappraisals, whether those are being done by town or city staff, or maybe more importantly, if those are being done by a contracted third party. Because the municipality has taken on great expense, entered into a contract agreement for that work to be fulfilled. And then what happens if the state sort of switches the light off and takes over the reappraisal through a new schedule?
That would also, if one town in a district or two had done a reappraisal in the last year or two, what happens with the other 4, 5, 6, 10, however, right?
When do they do it again? Right. So
We have a transition issue.
right.
So
So
section 63 address that. Do you have suggested changes to it?
no, again, this is a change we suggested, and the way that it is accommodated right now is that the reappraisal orders will stop on January 1st, 2027.
But you've
But
already.
starting now, or starting effective date of H 454, a municipality shall not enter into a contract that begins after that date as well. So that's good. That will stop this round robin problem from continuing towards 2030. I guess what I would like to caution is there still are going to be towns in a gray area. And again, this is what one of the things that needs to be sorted through so that we're not disadvantaging municipalities under a current obligation to reappraise or current reappraise process, and that we're not sort of disadvantaging the new future system. But undoubtedly, everyone agrees, or most people I've discussed this with agree, that the more reappraisals we can make complete in a timely manner between now and 2030, the better for this system change. Because we're using new, fair information that is relevant and useful to the reappraisers of the future. Something that was considered and we would like you to consider as well is that for municipal-wide max reappraisal and for annual maintenance of the grand list, the per parcel fee is not adequate in many or most circumstances. We had recommended that the state reconsider its reimbursement scheme for asking municipal officials to complete the statewide grand list at cost to the municipality. This is especially true in very small towns with very small grand lists, because there is, like in many areas, a minimum cost of doing business. So the municipality needs at least listers, at least a computer, at least a CAMA software. They need storage, they need to pay for data storage. Well, the state currently reimburses a per parcel fee that
Right.
is not adequate
Okay,
if you
you
have a
need an
300 parcel.
fee.
Yeah, so we suggested considering an increase to the per parcel fee, or considering a small town minimum, so that the towns that will never, you know, if they have 300 parcels, 500 parcels on the grand list, then they're, you know, bringing in a few $1,000s, but their costs are 10 to 20.
Software and a computer cost the
Right.
same if you've got 300 parcels or 30,000.
Exactly. And if you're interested in that, I have some, a breakdown of costs, reasonable costs to expect that I shared and would be happy to share with you. Lastly, we would also like you to consider, perhaps this is something to ask the stakeholder working group to consider, which is an option for municipal delegation. If I could briefly speak to the concept of municipal delegation, it has great precedence in Vermont state law as a bill in whole state. It happens often that a municipality sort of, as a smaller and often more nimble form of government, may expand its own areas of public service or its own authorities and through a charter process. And then later, the state takes on those public services or those jurisdictions. And that the municipality may say, hey, wait a second, we already made a process for this. We're already doing a great job at it. Or even we think our process is better than yours. Can we keep doing it? And the state has said yes. And then over time, municipality by municipality may consider or reconsider that decision and give it back to the state or ask for it back or whatever the case may be. In the case of reappraisal, this is a good thing to consider for mutually beneficial reasons. One is that for municipalities with particularly dynamic grand lists with many types of properties, and who are under a high pace of redevelopment or development, it is in the sort of common interest of the state and its revenues and the municipality and its revenues to reappraise more frequently by property class than once every 6 years. And so we don't want to make that municipality suffer and have sort of a stale grand list if they're equipped to keep it up.
Okay. So you're suggesting just adding this to the list of things the stakeholder group?
Yeah.
Okay, I might be okay with that, but I would be concerned that if too many towns opt out or are allowed to opt out because they meet certain standards, then it sort of defeats the whole purpose of having enough towns in an area to get a reappraisal at a lower cost and to get interest in from outside firms to come in and do the reappraisal. You just,
Yeah.
That's
a balance.
That's a reasonable concern, especially municipalities of a certain size.
yeah,
However, I'll just say the ability to perform an excellent reappraisal at and above the state standard is not a big town, small town thing. There are some very, very small towns that are performing at a very high level, their reappraisal. There are some very large municipalities that are really struggling with the resources they need to do that. So it's not, so I think it's something to be discussed and worked out and understand if they're a floor. But it's not an assumption like, oh, all 11 cities will do it.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's totally fair. There are small towns that are on top of all their stuff. And they're all in my district now. But I mean, if in my district, if Middlebury were to opt out, that's like a huge chunk of the parcels. So it would put pressure on cost for everybody else. So
Yeah.
sort of challenging.
These are the things we're going to ask that stakeholder, group, if we end up on stakeholder group, to deal with.
That's our recommendation.
And I'm watching this.
Just a quick question. I was part of the Burlington reappraisal, so I know it's really jarring for a lot of people. I'm wondering, are there any guidelines or are there any limits to who can grieve? And I mean, can anyone grieve their reappraisal? Or are there?
Any property owner can agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, and I mean, the only reason I'm asking this is because as I'm thinking about a possible huge increase in the regional reappraisal grievances, I was wondering if there might be some limitations that we could put on grievances.
I would direct that question to PBR, who they provide they consult on questions like that with municipal officials.
Okay.
I would say generally, to my understanding of best practice, is to create a low level opportunity for correction, like an administrative correction.
Yeah.
That often can kind of clear out. And it's totally fair. Like so if you may get your property valuation and say, this says I have this much square footage of deck. I took my deck down 3 years ago.
Right.
Like come out here and look and see I don't have a deck.
Yeah.
But do we need to go through a VCA hearing to determine that your deck's no longer there? But I think PBR's got some great insight into how to.
But it does
that.
get into due process. I
Mhm.
forget what we were looking at. I think it was something to make it easier. And we were told that there is a right to due process. So
Okay.
people have a right to grieve their appraisal.
Can a not interested party file a grievance or appeal an appraisal?
I don't think so. I will say I've done informal sort of auditing of grievance hearings. It's something you hear a lot in the complaint by the property owner is a comparison.
Yeah, right.
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 So they're like, I went to
It's
that
indirect. It's
Halloween
indirect.
party and I saw that my neighbor has a renovated basement and I don't, so mine should be less, but that's not necessarily a fair,
It's indirect.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Consideration for the appraiser. Yeah.
That was a very specific.
But I mean, no, that's what you.
I just like Halloween.
I'm a 3-bedroom rent, they're a 3-bedroom rent,
Right.
they're located,
Sure.
Right.
yeah,
Sure. Yeah.
hear a lot of that.
So one.
If you want to say 5,
No, I don't.
I don't.
I just want to make sure I understand, because so the bottom line is you basically support what the House ended up with in this part of the bill.
Yeah.
One suggestion is to add the municipal delegation
And then,
question to the stakeholder group.
and to consider a minimum. And I think
Minimum.
a small town minimum for per parcel amounts for reappraisal and brandless maintenance in the interim period. And I really believe that's in the state's interest here. Like, if we help towns meet the need of brandless maintenance and reappraisal between now and 2030, when you've set a goal in this bill to change the system in a dramatic way, big changes here, then that will be good. And so if we can help the towns that are sort of suffering and under-resourced in meeting the needs of reappraisal and brandless maintenance, I think that's good for everybody.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's all I got.
Okay,
Um,
thank you. That is. These are, I think, the end of the bill. They're probably gonna be some of the easiest decisions we make, but probably some of the hardest for you. Those are good suggestions. Okay, I'm going to move on to Mimi Bernstein. She's here, she is on Zoom. Here comes Mimi. Welcome, just identify yourself for the record and then the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Mimi Burstein, representing the Vermont Assessors and Listers Association today. I currently serve as their membership and education coordinator, and I'm on the legislative committee. I have 15 years of experience in the assessment industry. Currently, I work as an assessor and lister for multiple towns, and I also hold the Vermont Master Property Assessor Level 4 designation. And that's the voluntary PBR designation. So today I'm here on behalf of VALA to express our significant concerns regarding the proposed implementation of the regional assessment districts. We believe it is essential to address the challenges and unanswered questions surrounding this proposal. I'm going to be reading my testimony today.
Send that in to us.
Yeah.
Did you have sent that in so we have it in writing?
Well,
Okay,
you have
good.
it. I sent
Okay.
it to Charlotte.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I'm taking notes, so I don't have my computer open.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So first and foremost, we believe this plan is being set in motion without adequate stakeholder input or sufficient planning. We feel that the Department of Taxes Property Valuation and Review Division is currently understaffed to lead such a large-scale transformation. This is truly a case of putting the cart before the horse, and moving forward too quickly risks undermining the entire system. Our central concern is cost. We're concerned about the cost of implementation is unclear, underestimated, or completely unaddressed. There's no realistic funding sources are identified, especially in section 61 and 62 through 64. The regional assessing districts management costs are likely to fall on municipalities and not on the state. Our second concern is unintended consequences. There are several unintended consequences we must consider. The shortage of qualified appraisers may worsen with staff shortages. Municipalities may face backlogs and processing delays. And with those delays, the exponentially increased cost for more frequent reappraisals instead of where we're at right now. We feel like there will be higher costs with questionable quality improvements and potential for price gouging due to demand. We also believe there are operational and logistical concerns. How PVNR will manage and coordinate new assessing districts with the current staffing they have now. The oversight of contractors is unclear, and who ensures quality and accountability. There's a need for additional staff and major increases in the current PVNR resources and budgets. And who is responsible for the homestead classification and reporting? And we also believe there's going to be an equity and an administrative burden. The proposed system risks creating inequalities in parcel classifications and valuation. Additionally, the administrative burden for homestead filings will increase significantly. If municipal employees are responsible, why should municipal taxes go up to support a function that supports the state education funding? We also believe there is a threat to public trust, that these sweeping changes, if implemented too quickly, risk eroding public trust in the assessment process. There's also a need for checks and balances if the state is managing its own grand lists. And the recommendations to move forward responsibly, we urge the committee to establish the working group immediately composed of the municipal leaders, appraisers, PBR staff, and legislators before enacting legislation with so many potential issues. We want to see them phase in the regional assessment districts gradually rather than in just 2 years. We want to prioritize strengthening the existing PBR system now. And clearly define and assign costs to the state and not to the municipalities, and resolve language and inconsistencies to provide clear definitions regarding assessment, ownership dates, and classifications. Right now, some of the homesteads still say homestead owners as of April 1st, and then sometimes you're saying assessment owners as of January 1st, and that's unclear and confusing. And in closing, the current draft of this bill raises more questions than it answers. It is not ready for implementation in its current form. We must slow down, gather input, and approach this with the care and thoughtfulness that such a foundational change demands. Finally, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. Just because it's in front of it's like in front of us. And so I appreciate your time and consideration, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Mimi, we've been told, and I haven't heard it challenged, that towns, one of the reasons PBR is doing this is not necessarily education grand list, but because towns are not able, especially small towns, are not able to hire a professional appraiser because it's not worth their time or money to do 300 properties. So the thought was, if we merge it into 900 properties or 1,000, that then it would be worth their while and you would probably get some cost savings. And we also know that the CLA is causing town taxpayers issues with their school taxes. So the towns seem to be caught between a rock and a hard place. You're being adjusted by the CLA, but you can't get an appraiser. So this was, my understanding, a move to help towns get their appraisals current so that everybody is being taxed equitably. But there are obvious challenges to implementation. I'm a little skeptical when it comes to spending money and agreeing how quickly towns might do that. I've been through more than one appraisal process. And to have to share that with another town, yes, could be challenging. Also, depending on who the appraiser is and their knowledge of the local market. So I think this is the end of the bill. I don't think it is actually necessary for the entire bill, but we will definitely keep working on it. Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Mimi, for being with us today. Are you familiar with the Act 68 report from 2023 and all of the work that went into that report? Okay, because that was a 2-year report. Act 68 was passed in 2023. There were several stakeholder groups involved in that report. It's based on national research, and there was an enormous amount of data and information that was analyzed as part of that report, and a major effort by PBR. And a lot of the things that the recommendations that came out of that report are what is in the bill, and has been modified, in fact. And then the
there's another stakeholder group that is also put in the bill. And the whole thing wouldn't go into effect for another 5 years. So there's a long transition for the requirements. So to ask for more time and more research seems like a lot of that has already been done. So I'm not sure what the goal of that would be, except for to delay it so it dies.
I don't see that as the case. I was part of, I was very much in tune in tracking that Act 63 of, the Act 68 of 2023. I do feel a lot of the recommendations that were made were lost in House Ways and Means when this bill was being developed. I think it would be fruitful to, if you guys want to relook at that, because there was a lot that was dropped between that report and what came through now. As for right now, I can speak. I just went through a reappraisal in one of my towns. We just finished, and I am starting to work with other towns that are going out for like 2027, 28, and 29. And the reappraisal companies, like you say, just because if you take what is just 300 parcels, it's not worth them. They can't do it. But now if we're going to be 40,000 parcels, you've just lost a huge chunk of the local middle-sized companies that usually can do the reappraisals, and you're going to lose those companies because they're too small to do that. I think Ed's going to talk from Nimerick, and you should listen to that. Now you're just going to have bigger companies because so many parcels is really hard for Vermont to do, especially with our geography. We have mountains, so you just can't go east and west so easily. So I think that needs to be something to pay attention to. The districts in Act 2023 has changed from then to now. And the 6 years, like I had a reappraisal in 2024. So by law, my 6 years is up in 2030, right? But there's no contracts that can be made after 2027, right? And we have to wait till 2030 for this to be implemented. So when does my 6 years start? 2024 or 2030? And then is it 2036 when I get my reappraisal? Because then I'm 12 years out. What do I do in the meantime with my town? Especially if there's development changes or any other changes. I don't think these questions have been answered. And that's, something that we want to slow down and talk about.
Other questions? Thank you. I think you can assume this conversation is going to continue. Next, we've got Peter Tucker.
Hi, Peter Tucker with the Vermont Association of Realtors. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy. I'd like to thank the chair and members of the committee for having me in today to talk about H 454. Vermont Association of Realtors are about 1,700 members in the state. We work with and for property owners every day. I work with a group of realtors on our government affairs committee who we meet every other week and, have been obviously really interested in this bill, as well as the housing bills that we've supported pretty consistently through the last several years. When I look at the National Association of Realtors, Vermont Association of Realtors, our mission is pretty clear. Our mission is to promote home ownership and to protect private property rights. That is something that we really try to stay clear to, and I think is really drives kind of, our thinking on everything. I'd like to start out with section 52 today, just briefly, because there is something, it's page 106, if you've got your bill. That, you know, as I'm reading through the bill, I'm like, well, you know, there are other things that impact real estate. And this is about the credit amount at the time of transfer of a property. And, you know, I think what's happened in practice is that at closings after April 1st, right? If it's before April 1st, then the new tax bill is established and the new property owner takes it. But after April 1st and before the end of the year, you know, when a seller sells a property, typically the seller's attorney at closing, you know, and a seller who has income sensitivity, I should say, you know, has some benefit that was derived from their last year's tax bill. The seller's attorney will say, look, you know, the seller should be compensated for this for, you know, the entire amount. And as a result, buyers often get a bill at closing that says, here's the difference between the property tax bill and the and you know what the seller, you know, would have received had they owned the property through the entirety of the year. This bill is going to change that. You know, let's see, it's 6063 or 6063 B2 transfers of property. The tax credit shall cease to be in effect as of the date of the transfer. So that, and I talked to a retired title insurance attorney about this, and you know, he said, well, you know, really, this is a much more equitable way to treat the buyer, especially because the buyer will now be able to file for their own credit for that year, and you know, and going forward. But I am telling you that's not the way sellers' attorneys have been doing this so far. So if this does go into effect, or if you're planning on passing that, which I think is the right thing to do, you may want to talk to some attorneys, you know, to get their opinion on that.
So you do support that language?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. You know, and I mean, when I talked to the title attorney yesterday, and he said, you know, I've represented buyers, and it's not at closing, all of a sudden they've got to compensate the seller for.
Especially when the seller, it's a tax credit, it's not money you pay.
Right.
And when the seller is moving to Florida,
Mhm.
that has caused some consternation.
Mhm. Yeah. So later in this section of the bill, 6068, it says the municipality shall not be required to issue an adjusted property tax bill. So I'm not exactly sure, you know, where that credit, you know, the credits applied to the bill for all four orders, if you will. You know, they don't adjust the bill.
What page? Sorry.
I'm sorry, that is on 122. Yeah. Mhm. Yep, I did try to make some page notes because it's such a huge bill.
Yes.
So, you know, I think that it's something that needs to be worked out. Senator Matos, you probably had that closings, you know, where that comes up. So, good. So that just something that I kind of looked at, and I thought it was, you know, worth, you know, bringing up in this discussion. So just skip to regional assessment districts. You know, I think that, you know, having current and reasonable estimates of value of properties is really good for realtors. I mean, the better the towns are at assessing properties, the more accurate they are. You know, not easier, but you know, it sets values that we can count on. And so, you know, we're generally supportive of the regional assessment districts. I heard Tax yesterday talking about the 12 county districts. And I would hope that members of this committee will communicate with members of the Senate Education Committee that these districts would line up very well with school districts as well. You know, I just think that, you know, the chair's point about, you know, half the school districts in one tax district and another, you know, there's a lot of confusion there. And it just seems to make sense. It's between 5 and 119, I think, is, you know, kind of somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere in there.
Exactly in the middle. So you know, I think that's a good thing. You know, getting on the 6-year cycles can be incredibly challenging. You've heard that from the assessors. To require listers and assessors to annually update the grand list is going to be a big lift for them. And for the commissioner of the Department of Taxes to determine and assign tax classifications for every grand list parcel by October 1st, 2028 is also going to be a heavy lift. One thought that we had was, is there a way as these districts are set up to take advantage of the talent within the districts, listers and assessors to build a team that can do
Which
appraisals?
is why, yeah.
Yeah.
So you've got, because a lot of these are independent practices. There's one guy, sometimes it's two. And yeah, they couldn't do a whole county, but if there were 3 or 4, 2 guys, then
Exactly.
you would have enough of a team to be able to do it in a reasonable amount of time.
As I've listened to testimony about, hiring out of state appraisal companies, that's what occurred to us, that, if we could build the teams within the districts that could do those appraisals, we keep the money in the state.
And they also know their districts having.
Right. I don't know if they could do their own district or would they have to do other
I don't know, but I
towns,
know there was a time where the feds, after the
Mhm.
exotic
Right.
mortgage scandals, where
More of an
banks
arm's length.
could not have a relationship with listers, and you would get a lister from Massachusetts
Mhm.
who would call the office and say, "Where is Essex?"
Yes.
And they didn't know the local market or reality, and that led to issues. So there's a balance in there.
Exactly. So just, some thoughts there.
Yeah.
But generally, I think that, getting more accurate and more current appraisal information is good for our marketplace. So now I'd like to turn to section 61, property tax classifications. And, this is an interesting discussion here. So, we all know that the proposal is for 4 different classifications at this point in time, going up from homestead and non-homestead, the 2 that we have currently. Homestead, pretty easy to understand. We have a suggestion on the non-homestead apartment category, if that continues. And that really would be more accurately described as non-homestead residential rental. Because it's a more accurate way to talk about single family homes that are rented, right? Apartments are apartments, but many single family homes are rented on a year-round basis. And then we get to non-homestead residential. And, as we kind of talk around the issue all the time, I'm going to take this one on directly. Non-homestead residential are second homeowners. It's plain and simple, and it's pretty easy to see that that they potentially would receive a higher tax rate through this delineation of non-homestead rates. Second homeowners are generally tourists who came here, visited the state, really liked it, and bought a home here. Second homeowners are here largely to use recreational amenities, purchasing ski passes and spending money in the community. Second homeowners contract for services, including landscaping, plowing, and all types of property maintenance and management services. These services are provided by Vermont companies who employ Vermonters. Second homeowners pay their taxes, and they use relatively few public services like schools. But when it comes down to adding tax classifications as outlined for this proposal, there's one fundamental reason why this shouldn't be considered. Broad-based taxes are the fairest and best way to administer tax policy. Broad-based taxes apply the smallest incremental tax increase across the broadest tax population to support the operation of government. You start splitting up property classifications, you dilute that effort. This is something that I testified to in Ways and Means. And, as you're getting ready for testimony with a new committee, I'm like, I believe this to be the truth, but I better check myself. So I just Googled tax policy. And one of the first question that popped up is, what are the goals of tax policy? The purpose of taxes is to raise needed revenue, not to favor or punish specific industries, activities, and products. Minimizing tax preferences broadens the tax base so the government can raise sufficient revenue with lower rates. The broader the base, the lower the rate. We're challenged this year, we, the legislature and advocates and the administration as well, on education funding reform. Section 61 of this bill does not address the complexities of education finance reform. It just creates new ways to increase taxes on property owners in Vermont. This is not what the taxpayers asked you to do. They asked you to find ways to reduce the cost to provide an excellent education to our Vermont youth. Section 61 of this bill does nothing to accomplish this objective. It just sets the stage for continued controversy over tax policy on an annual basis. As a result, we would like to see this section removed from the bill, stay with homestead and non-homestead property taxes. That's my testimony. Thank you.
Okay, question.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Peter. I appreciate your testimony. It's more of a comment than a question, and I'll make it brief, but I hear the argument a lot that second homeowners don't, they don't use the education system, so why should they pay, property taxes or higher property taxes? They use the graduates of our schools, and the graduates of our schools are the ones who are going to be doing the lawn mowing and the pickup and doing the roads and working in the hospitals and all of that. So to me, it is germane and it is important that they participate in that way. But it is an argument I hear a lot, so I just wanted to address it.
And I would say that they do participate in a major, their taxes go to the education system. So, they're not trying to shirk that duty. I understand your point though.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Nice to see everyone.
Okay. Now we have Enter Gladfelter from the memory.
Got it all warmed up. Thank you.
Okay. Just identify yourself for the record and the floor is yours.
I'm Ed Gladfelter. I'm the senior appraiser for New England Municipal Resource Center. I'm one of those stakeholders we've been talking about. And Madam Chair, I go back to the CAPTAT days as well. So this is the testimony that I presented to the House Ways and Means Committee. And I think I can bring a little bit of perspective you probably don't hear from other stakeholders. And that we've been doing a lot of reappraisal projects and have many. I'll try to quickly go over some of these points. A lot of discussion about the reappraisal assessment districts. And a chart on the left is basically the projects that NIMRIC either has done or is doing or is about to do. And my point with that is that we already do assessment districts. We are staffed with, I have 20 assessors that work with me right now. So we're staffed all over the state to be able to accommodate those specific areas of the state. We've been doing a lot of those. And then the chart on the right are the areas that have used our CAMA system. And there are 190 municipalities throughout the state that use our system. And they range from, Searsbury to 123 parcels. We do those small towns. Up to South Burlington, and we consult and help them up there as well. So we are working, in a pretty wide area across the state. Just real quickly, talking about projects that how far out we're going. So we're out to 2030. And you see we have 82 projects already lined up with over 82,000 properties over the next 6 years, including this year. I do have, and this is wrong, I actually have 6 towns for 2030 at this point in time. And we also do consulting with those small towns, those listers, help them do their own projects. And there are still listers that do that. And they just need some hand holding and some guidance. And I'm working with 3 towns now that are helping them do their own reappraisal. And we also provide assessment services to over 50 towns throughout Vermont. Ranging from just going out and doing some inspections with houses and all the way up to, full assessor services. We're the people that are in charge of everything that's there. The pandemic really created, a problem for us. If you look at the projects, the towns and their last reappraisal projects, we've had several that had not done reappraisals for quite some time. I'm doing 3 towns right now that their last reappraisal was 2007. It's a long time ago. And it's hard to catch up in that case a lot of times. So in the last 10 years, we've done 167 appraisals throughout the state, not just us, but everybody else involved. In the last 5 years, we've done 108. And if you take those bottom years and kind of look at where they're at now, a lot of those are being completed now, 25 through 2030. So another 120 projects that are already in books are about to be completed. My point being that there really was a crisis because of the pandemic, but we've slowly worked our way through it. The crisis state is really no longer there. I'm not saying we don't have to continue to work hard at what we've been doing, but the essence of what prompted a lot of this is really no longer in place. Getting rid of the CLA trigger was a really, really smart thing. That was part of the problem that we all had to deal with. That was good. If you're going to go to a 6-year cycle, and these are pulling together of some of those reassessment districts. So if you're going to do a 6-year cycle, you have to do 2 of those districts a year. So what we're doing is we're taking what in the past has been somewhat of a really loosely now an 8, 10, 12-year cycle and making that a 6-year cycle. So we're going to significantly increase the frequency of reappraisals. What I'm going to tell you is that there's a lot of cost associated with that. It's not going to come as cheap as I'm afraid people think it might sometimes. What I did on the right, I just laid out the staffing requirements. This is what I do with my own business. And so if we're going to do a 20,000 parcel reassessment district, you're going to have at least 8 staff just for data collection to do that. There's going to have to be at least 2 administrative clerks to deal with that side of things, a couple of analysts and a couple of supervisors. So that those 14 people will be involved with that reappraisal district, especially if you're going to do that over a course of 1 year. Personally, I'd rather do that over a 2-year time frame, which might extend some of that a little bit better. If you're going to go to 50,000, doing the districts at once, you're talking about 20 data collection staff. Otherwise, we talked about cost for all that, but I can tell you that if you're going to have that 14 staff, you're probably talking about somewhere between $875,000 just for the staffing cost. That doesn't include health insurance, unemployment insurance, workman's comp, office space, travel, hotels, maintenance, none of that stuff. That's just a salary portion of that. So that's what it would take to get qualified people to be able to do that sort of work. I'm most concerned about the complexity of these projects. I'm going to talk about Addison County.
Thank you.
And you look at the stars; those are projects that I've been involved with in the last 2 or 3 years. But so there's 23 towns that are in Addison County. And the point of this is that they're really diverse in terms of what kinds of municipalities they really are. Shoreham, Bridgeport, and Addison, they're somewhat similar. We did Shoreham and Bridgeport last year, but they're sort of lakefront sort of towns. We were able to coordinate a lot of the same data for Shoreham and Bridgeport. Last year, we also did Moncton, Starksboro, and Lincoln. They're kind of right there together. It was another little assessment district that we did. I can use sales from all 3 towns to work together with those. And then we got the Middlebury, Cornwall, Wadebridge area. We're just finishing a project in Wadebridge right now, and I've done Middlebury multiple times and then Wadebridge in the past. And they're somewhat similar in their impact, but within them, there's some real differences. Just Middlebury alone, there are 4 different valuation components that require 4 different sorts of land configurations for the residential side. And there's 3 more land configurations for the commercial side, mostly because of the college and the surrounding area. You get over East Middlebury, it's a different animal as well. So they aren't all the same. And that's part of what my point is with all that. Virginia's and Bristol, they're different from Middlebury. We're doing Virginia's right now. So they're somewhat similar. And then you have Ripton, Granville, Hancock, and Goshen that are nothing like the rest of them. So there's real diversity with that. And so as a contractor, I can't come in there doing a reappraisal and put one set of system in place for all the whole district. I'm gonna have to really break that out by the types of properties that the municipalities that there are within that reappraisal district. It's not real simple to deal
You
with.
sound like somebody who's trying to make a school district out of those same towns.
There you go. So we're staffed to deal with the red. I look at it do over a 2-year period. But if we were going to shift to doing the reassessment districts, because we're located around the state, I'd have to move my staff in to work in that specific area. And just from maybe to be aware, there's additional cost for us for that as well. Now we have travel costs, hotel costs, food costs to be able to accomplish that. Mimi said something earlier about the district would eliminate the smaller companies. There are several, and they've been sort of growing a little bit, to tell you the truth. That these individuals or couple, 3 people that are working in these small jurisdictions, helping them out do stuff. This process, they can basically be put out of business primarily. There really are not any other appraisal companies in Vermont that's big enough to do this besides us. So you're talking about bringing in out-state firms to deal with all that.
That's the quick
Yes,
question
go ahead.
about that. Thank you. Does it have to be one company or one firm to do one geographic?
I don't know that we really know the answer to that. That's a really important question, I think. Can we go in with another company that lives in Vermont, that a competitor of ours? I really like those people, and I would like to work with them in a project. I don't know if that's right or wrong. At some point, somebody's in charge. That becomes what the issue is. Do they do things the same way that we do things? That I don't really know. That's a great question. I'm not sure that there's a lot of thought that these out-of-state companies will come in and be able to do this. I don't know that that's true, to tell you the truth. So Burlington, South Burlington did a reappraisal same year, and the company got the reappraisal project done. But they struggled to get staff to be able to do that. You're probably aware of that. It wasn't simple for them. You have Essex and Essex Junction now doing a reappraisal. They've had to delay for a year because the out-of-state company cannot find staff. They'll get it done, but it's not easy for them to do that. The regionalized districts cover a large area. So what's happening from that is we're increasing our driving time and our costs to be able to cover and do those reappraisals within that district. There's a significant amount of cost to that.
How long do you have to be on the school bus to do this?
Well, you're right. And my comment here is you're never good from Ferdinand to Canaan. That's tough drive, especially in the winter. And look out for the moose alongside the road. It's going to be over there. And there's also talk about there's this great cost efficiency by creating these districts. If it takes a half hour to inspect a property, it takes a half hour whether you're doing 500 or you're doing 5,000 or you're doing 50,000. It still takes a half hour. So I don't know that there's any efficiency in terms of time from that perspective by creating the districts in themselves. Vermont's a very rural state. We needed to do something in terms of a consistent cycle. The 6-year cycle was what was selected at that point in time. I still wonder if we can find enough companies to really complete that. But it does increase the frequency of reappraisals that we're doing from and requires a lot of coordination, because now you have Madison County, you've got 23 municipalities within that district. Now we have 23 listers offices and town clerk's offices and select boards that somebody has to be able to coordinate as a company that's doing the reappraisal in the district. That's a staff person just to do that, to deal with all those people that are involved with that. You've heard me say this before. I was here a couple of years ago. I said, my preference was always to do a 10-year cycle. And then we'd be able to do an update in that 4 to 6 year time frame at much less cost. At about a third less cost of what it would take to do a full reappraisal. I thought that was a good idea. There's been discussion about property valuation review. They're just not enough staff, and the type of experience that they have, they aren't there yet. So take a real change and so some increased staff and cost associated with that as well. I'm going quickly. I'm sorry. I'm trying to get through this.
No, it's good. Right.
So,
Right.
appraisal efficiency, we need to figure out some way to make this more efficient and quicker. Right now, we go up and we send out postcards, we go up and knock on the door, we go and do an inspection, measure the outside, take pictures, come back and put the data in. Very time consuming to do that across 50,000 properties in the reassessment district. Maybe we can implement, some technology, LiDAR or oblique imagery to reduce the time frame involved for physically measuring those properties that are there. Maybe we need to eliminate or reduce the number of interior inspections that we do as a possibility. Go ahead.
For all that postcards and notifications, what percent do you actually interior inspect?
It varies across the towns.
Yeah.
So I say anywhere between 25 and 50.
Mhm.
And sometimes the listers in Worcester did their own and they took 2 years to do 400 properties.
Mhm.
They got into almost all of them. So it really, we were working in a town that my staff complained that everybody was home. So we got into almost all of them, but it takes a lot of time. People want to talk.
Of course they do.
And it's that part of it's fun. It really is. So it really varies.
Yeah.
Depends on where you're at. So if we're not doing all those interior inspections, then the equity becomes an issue. What are we missing? Are we being consistent in terms of that process?
And sorry, Martine, real quick. With that, how do the equity question, if you go into 2 homes on the same street at a 10, do you spread the quality of the 2 homes you saw across, like if the outside of all the homes on the street are relatively the same and you inspect 2 homes on the inside and they're relatively the same, do you spread that across the whole street? Is that kind of how that goes?
They correlate together pretty well. What you would find is they one's a good proxy for the other. So somewhat, yes, we know. Fortunately, we have MLS. We have a lot of different data now. We can go see what's there better than we could in the past.
Okay.
So yes and no.
Okay.
The answer to that. When I was in a meeting with actually my competitors, I was sitting beside him. His process in terms of the small town issue, he says that for them to go into the small towns, frequently there's no permit process, there's no planning and zoning. So they're going into a small town, they don't know what's there. They spend a lot of time trying to figure out where they got to go and where they're coming from. And so that was why they said they don't bid those small town projects, and they're just too time consuming, even though they're small in the parcels. And I thought that was an interesting comment. We do those small towns. I squeeze them in whenever I get a chance to do that. So I think without adequate, I hate to say this, without adequate statewide planning and zoning and some sort of permit process, it'd be hard to maintain that equity if we're doing technology to help us do a lot of our measurements. Just a word of caution. CAMA software, do you have to have the same CAMA software in each reassessment district? I can say 190 towns use our applications throughout the state. What I can tell you is whether they're using our system or somebody else's system, there's a real significant time and cost to switching software applications. It took us a long milk, it took a year to do that. I helped the Stoughton County and Washington State convert their system to our system. Took them over a year to do that. What significant cost? That's not an easy thing. It just is not. Our stuff ties in with the BTPI because we had the grant list around the state forever, so we know a lot of how to make that work. The appeals thing, it was mentioned earlier about they made an estimate for 1 to 3% for appeals. It's just wrong. It's 5 to 6%. I've done this for 40 years, and I'm also doing 17 towns right now. I can tell you that's going to be 5 to 6% for that initial level of appeals. For listers agreement, they just didn't have that one right. And I'm seeing a slight increase over time. I think people are much more aware that the values increase so much, and they got questions about that now.
Property tax.
They do. About the appeals process, the first level of the state, listers and assessors will deal with their basic level appeals, and then the reappraisal would go through the reappraisal district group that did the reappraisal. And then beyond that, they go to this regionalized assessment group, if you will, one member from each municipality become part of that. As mentioned earlier, do they all have to attend? Have to be a majority for that? I don't really know. And there's no specification about qualifications for those people. You're qualified. You were great. But there's not always, people come in sometimes and they don't have any real background or experience, and you just see it goes right over their head. So what they're proposing now, quite frankly, is no different from what we've got, but just on a bigger scale. To be this blunt about. Appeals beyond that group, then go to the tax commissioner. He or she is going to be busy, I think. This creates a unique blend between local and state and private contractors. Again, who assigns those contracts, and if the local area has their favorite contractor, they're going to be happy when somebody else has chosen to do their area. I don't really know how that's going to work. What if the local area doesn't agree with the valuations? What's the process for that going to be? That's part of the stakeholder issue. I understand. What if they don't get them done, Tom? What if a town does their tax bills in August, and they can get the reappraisal done in timely fashion? Are they going to delay doing their tax bills? I don't know. I don't know. Each RAS meeting for multiple municipalities requires extensive interaction with the local officials, like I said before, and requires a staff person just to deal with that. So the impact sort of on us is that we can certainly handle assessments in reappraisal district. We prefer to do a couple over a 2-year time frame if possible. We are going to generate more consistent appraisals and probably better values over time. And from a contractor's perspective, it's good for us, good for my competition. There's plenty of work for all of us to do that. So that it will be, there's plenty of work for all of us to take care of doing all that. But geography does matter. And we have to deal with this CAMA issue in terms of what would, if we have to have a single system within each jurisdiction. And I have some concerns. I think that the listers that are involved with doing the annual maintenance every year for each town, as we heard earlier, there's getting harder and harder to find them to do that. I think that's going to continue as we, quite frankly, as we age out a little bit, and as we put more restrictions, requirements of what they have to do to be certified to do that, they're going to drop away. We're staffed, trying to staff up to be able to accommodate dealing with the basic maintenance from year to year with towns. I'm not sure that a lot of the out-of-state firms are going to do that because it's expensive for them to put somebody in place to do that. But we will continue to do our, support and training. And like I said earlier, maybe this concern is somewhat true. We're kind of developing passing this legislation, if you will, and the stakeholders really haven't got together yet to talk about how to implement that. I think there's some real issues we have to really, we've talked about already to consider with all of that. So, again, as a person who's boots on the ground and is providing that sort of service to towns, there's a lot of things that for us to consider and be involved with. And I just wanted to hear from somebody who actually has to do the work, what's involved in terms of doing that. Open for any questions that you might have.
Thank you.
And I lived in a situation once where I was a property owner, and every year when I got my tax bill, my appraised value was different. I suspect they were doing a statistical update every year. I don't know how regular their reappraisal is. How common is that practice in the United States?
I've actually worked around the country.
Yeah.
A lot of places do annual assessment. And I will tell you that if you want to solve your CLA problem, do annual assessment. It goes away. In Washington State, for example, they do a 6-year cycle.
That's where it was. Washington State, Island County.
They do a 6-year cycle. They reinspect all the properties over 6 years, but every year they put in a new set of tables and new values every year.
Yeah.
So this goes away.
Yeah.
That's gone. And it becomes I worked in Harris County in Texas, which is Houston. They do annual assessments every year in Texas.
Sure.
Well, I just want to, as I think because you testified, I believe, in the committee, worked on Act 68,
Yes.
as you did in your
68.
Yeah,
Oh,
It-
yes.
the Act
This
68.
X68, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not the big Act 68, but the one that led to
Yeah.
the report that this is based on. And I think you were on Reeds and Beans as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of the testimony we heard was one, that there are a lot of inequities in our system right now. And there are inequities across property, but also across property owners. And that there's a lot of differences in how people are approaching the valuations. And the cycle is a problem. And so we 2 years ago implemented the 6-year cycle. So that's not a new thing, that's already existing law. And I mean, I was just skimming the report, just to make sure I remembered the recommendations. And they do recommend going to regional assessment districts. And while I hear you that there's a lot of sort of details to work out, it does seem like that's the sort of general, that our current system is so scattershot in a lot of ways. And some towns do a really great job with it, and some towns are really, really struggling. So I think sort of getting on the same playing field is really important. And there's nothing that I can see that would say you couldn't have 2 firms doing the district. So the small, medium firms, I don't think would go out of business. You could still have, there's nothing also, it says that you have to be done every 6 years, but if it takes 2 years to do it, it doesn't say that you couldn't do that. So I mean, it feels like some of the things that you're bringing up will be addressed through the stakeholder process where you're trying to figure out, and that this is just setting up over the next 5 years, you need to get there in 2030.
And we don't know. That's part of what we just don't know.
But there's
I agree
enough
with that.
time in there that things could get changed along the way. But if we don't set the dates in, then towns are gonna be in contracts they can't get out of. So this is really, it's important to have the language in there that sort of sets up the dates and the expectations while we're working out some of these details, it seems to me.
And part of the issue in the past has also been, it's been a little bit about geography in Vermont. And we've come from municipality, local towns, town to town doing their projects. And it's been a little inconsistent. It's part of the New England issue. Just in terms of how we have operated in New England versus working with a big county out west. And it's a little bit of a different appraisal issue for that. I'm working, for example, in Washington State, and to go from very wide range of portions of the county, I would say, you're gonna go out to this part of the county and pick up the debt, and said, yeah, it's a 4-hour drive.
Yeah.
Get out there. For stuff. So it's a little bit unique to us from that perspective.
Mhm.
And I understand why they came up with the assessment district, because I think the focus of that though was to try to allow for bigger companies to come in and do those appraisals, make it economically feasible for them.
Well, and also to have consistency and equity across districts, I think also. And since we don't have county government, they had to make something up, so I can give you my county government spiel, but.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you.
You're welcome.
It is always good to hear from people that actually do the work.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Committee, I think that is it.